What if they take it from me? What if they take them? The neon-drenched streets of New Orleans buzzed with an unrelenting energy, as if the city itself was alive, breathing through its towering skyscrapers and the endless flow of people. Every corner was illuminated by flashes of light, creating a kaleidoscope of colors that seemed to shift with every step you took. In the midst of the chaos, Maxim Rivers moved through the crowd, his sleek black suit glinting with the faint scars of his latest mission. His mission had been successful, another infiltration, another win, but the battle had left him weary. All he wanted now was peace, a quiet drink, and a chance to reflect. But then fate intervened. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, revealing a figure that stopped him in his tracks. She was standing in the doorway of a crumbling building, sheltering herself from the drizzle, her striking green skin glowing softly under the neon lights. Her hair, long and straight, shimmered like emerald strands cascading down her back. Her outfit, tattered and worn, spoke of a life lived on the edge. But what truly caught Maxim's attention wasn't her appearance, it was the way she moved, fluid, graceful, almost feline. She was a Lunari, a cat-like alien from the distant Andromeda galaxy. But something about her was different. Something about her made him hesitate, made him wonder if the universe had just handed him a new twist of fate. Her green eyes locked onto his, a glint of curiosity sparking as she tilted her head with that unmistakable feline grace. "You going to stand there all night, human?" she asked, her voice light, almost playful. "Or are you going to help a lady out?" Maxim's heart skipped a beat, but he stayed composed. "Depends on what kind of help you're asking for." Her lips curved into a sly smile. "My name's Sophie Hart. Looks like I'm in a bit of a bind. I could use some temporary shelter." Something in her voice, the way she said it. There was a story behind those words, and Maxim was more than intrigued. Against his better judgment, he offered her a place to stay, unaware that this seemingly simple decision would soon lead him into the most unpredictable chapter of his life. Maxim led Sophie into his apartment, the soft hum of the elevator ride doing little to quiet the storm of thoughts in his mind. She hadn't said much since they'd left the street, but he could feel her curiosity, the unspoken questions hanging between them. The elevator dinged softly as it reached his floor, and they stepped out into a quiet corridor. Sophie glanced around, her keen eyes taking in the details of the space. "It's nice," she said, her voice almost wistful. "It'll do for now," Maxim replied, unlocking the door. "It's just me here, so don't expect a luxury suite." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "I don't need luxury, just somewhere I can rest for a bit." Maxim watched her closely as she stepped inside, noticing how she paused to take in the view of the room, her fingers brushing the edges of a nearby table, as if she were cataloging her surroundings. "Not much here," he muttered, feeling the unfamiliar weight of a guest in his space. "But it's comfortable enough." Sophie smiled, though it was tinged with something sad. Comfort is a luxury for those who've never been desperate. Maxim hesitated, then broke the silence. "What happened to you? You're not like any Lunari I've ever met." Sophie's smile faded. She turned toward the window, her back to him. "I was born into a life I didn't choose. A companion, a servant, a tool to be used by the elite of my kind. But I didn't want that. I couldn't accept a life where my only worth was tied to someone else's whims." Maxim watched her closely, thoughts swirling. "So you ran. You left all that behind." Sophie nodded, her voice softening. "I had no choice. The life I was meant to live, the one that was written for me, suffocated me. I wanted freedom. I wanted to choose my own path, to decide what kind of life I would live." Maxim took a step closer, his curiosity getting the best of him. "And now? What are you going to do now that you're here with me?" Sophie's eyes flickered to him for a brief moment before she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know. Maybe I'm just looking for a safe place, somewhere to regroup before I figure out what's next. And maybe I'm just tired of being alone." There was a long silence between them. Maxim could feel the weight of her words, the vulnerability that seemed to surround her despite her strength. He nodded slowly, understanding more than she knew. "You're not alone," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not anymore." Sophie turned toward him, her eyes searching his face. "Thank you," she said softly, as if the words themselves were foreign on her tongue. "I didn't expect kindness from anyone, let alone a human." Maxim smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. I don't know why I'm doing this, but something tells me I'm supposed to help you. Sophie tilted her head, her feline grace apparent in the way she moved. And what if you regret it? He met her gaze with determination. Then I'll deal with it, one step at a time. A few days passed in an odd kind of silence between Maxim and Sophie. She was quiet, focused, almost distant at times, as though her mind was preoccupied with something deeper than just their temporary living arrangement. But Maxim couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something invisible but palpable between them. It wasn't just the way she moved, her feline grace still a mystery to him. It was the way she looked at him, like she was studying him, her eyes intense, probing, even though she rarely spoke. And then there was the change in her. Maxim had noticed it first when they'd been sitting together in the living room one night. Sophie had been quiet, almost withdrawn, her emerald eyes staring out at the neon-lit skyline beyond the windows. She looked distant, almost like a person lost in thought. You've been acting strange lately, Maxim finally said, breaking the silence. I don't mean to pry, but is everything okay? Sophie turned slowly to look at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she said nothing, her eyes scanning his face, as if measuring the sincerity of his words. Then, as if making a decision, she sighed softly. There's something I need to tell you, Maxim, she said, her voice quieter than usual, almost trembling. Something that's happening to me. Maxim put his drink down, his gaze sharpening. What do you mean? Is it about the situation you've been dealing with? About your past? She shook her head, her green hair catching the light as it fell around her shoulders. No, it's more personal. She hesitated, as if she was struggling with the right words. I'm not sure how to explain this, but Maxim, I think I'm pregnant. Maxim blinked, his mind struggling to comprehend her words. Pregnant? He took a deep breath, looking at her more closely. But that's impossible, right? You're a Lunari. How could that even happen? You said you're not like us. Sophie's expression softened, her eyes carrying a sorrowful understanding. I know it doesn't make sense, but it's true. I feel it, Maxim. Something's changing inside me. I can't explain it any better than that, but I know it's real. I can sense it. Maxim stood, pacing the room as the weight of her words began to sink in. You're telling me this now. His mind raced as he processed everything. This wasn't just some strange twist of fate, it was something else entirely. He turned to her, his face tense with concern. This could be dangerous. There's no telling what could happen. What if? Sophie stood up, cutting him off with a sharp gesture. I didn't ask for this, Maxim, she snapped, her voice thick with emotion. I don't understand what's happening either. I don't know why or how it's possible, but it's happening, and I don't know what to do about it. Maxim stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest as he looked at Sophie. The intensity in her voice hit him harder than expected. Sophie, I didn't mean to. But she raised her hand, silencing him with a look. No, Maxim, you don't get it. I wasn't expecting this, but here we are. Her eyes softened then, as if a new layer of vulnerability was slipping through. I'm scared, okay? I don't know what to do, and I don't want anyone to find out. If the wrong people find out about this, they'll come after us. After them. Maxim's chest tightened at the mention of them. The thought of their potential children, the thought of what they might mean to the galaxy, hit him harder than anything else. This wasn't just a personal matter anymore. This could change everything. We'll figure it out together, he said, though he could feel the uncertainty in his own voice. He knew that whatever was happening, it wasn't just about protecting Sophie, it was about protecting something much bigger. Sophie gave him a small, grateful smile. I don't know what's happening, Maxim, but I can feel it. There's something in me, growing, and I don't know if I can handle it on my own. Maxim walked toward her, his steps steady. You won't have to handle it alone. I'm with you, and we'll get through this no matter what. Sophie's gaze softened, the weight of the moment passing between them. Thank you, she whispered. As the days passed, Sophie's condition became more evident. The changes in her body were subtle at first, but Maxim couldn't help but notice the slight shift in her demeanor. She was still the same strong, independent woman, but there was a new softness in her eyes, an air of fragility that hadn't been there before. Every day, It seemed like the pregnancy was progressing faster than either of them had anticipated. One evening, as Maxim walked into the living room after a long day, he found Sophie staring at herself in the mirror, her hand resting on her abdomen. She was pale, and there was an unfamiliar look of wonder and fear in her expression. As he approached, she didn't even seem to notice him at first, her attention entirely focused on the changes she could feel. "Is it getting worse?" Maxim asked softly, concern lacing his words. Sophie turned to face him, her eyes wide. "Yes, it's happening faster than I expected. I can feel them moving inside me. It's like they're already aware of the world outside." Maxim stepped closer, his breath catching in his chest as he looked at her. "Are you sure this is safe?" Sophie closed her eyes, as if trying to calm herself. "I don't know, Maxim. I don't know if it's safe, but there's no stopping it now. Whatever's happening inside me is real, and it's growing." Maxim reached out, placing his hand on her shoulder. "We'll find out what's going on, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect you and them." Sophie gave a faint smile, the faintest hint of trust in her eyes. "I never thought I'd find someone who would say that." Maxim's heart softened at the words. He hadn't expected to find someone like Sophie, someone who challenged him, who made him think differently. But now that she was here, now that their paths had crossed in this strange, uncharted way, he knew he would protect her with everything he had. He had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't afraid. Maxim couldn't sleep. His mind raced with thoughts of what Sophie had shared with him. Her condition was accelerating, and he couldn't shake the fear that it wasn't just a matter of time before someone would come looking for them. The universe had a way of throwing the most complicated challenges at him, and this one, he feared, would be his most dangerous yet. He was sitting in the living room, the dim lights of New Aralis casting long shadows across the room when his secure communication unit buzzed. Maxim froze, his instincts kicking in as he checked the incoming message. It was a coded transmission, high priority. The message flashed on the screen. "Starforce command, immediate action required." Maxim's heart sank. He knew the tone all too well. He had hoped to avoid the attention of his superiors, but now it seemed inevitable. He pressed the button, and the familiar face of his commander appeared. "Hayes," the commander's stern voice crackled through the speaker. "We have a situation. The Genetic Council is aware of your situation. You're being tracked. We need you to report in immediately. You're in more danger than you think." Maxim's stomach twisted. "They found us?" "Not just found you. They know about the hybrid," the commander replied coldly, as if the very mention of the word was enough to send a chill through the room. "And they want her, and the child. They're already making moves." Maxim stood up abruptly, his fists clenching. "How long do we have?" "Not long," the commander replied. "You've got less than 24 hours before they move in. You need to get Sophie Hart out of there and off the grid. We'll give you a window, but you have to act fast." Maxim's mind was a blur, the weight of the commander's words settling over him. He turned and glanced over at Sophie, who was sitting in the kitchen, her back to him, her head lowered in thought. He could feel the tension in the air, as if they were both waiting for something they couldn't control. "I'll do what I have to," Maxim said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "But I need to know, how far are they willing to go?" The commander's face hardened. "All the way. The Genetic Council has their own agenda, and they won't stop until they get what they want. You've got no choice but to run." Maxim's blood ran cold as the weight of the words settled into his bones. He knew the risks. He had been part of special operations for too long to not understand how ruthless these organizations could be. But this was different. This was personal. "Understood," Maxim replied curtly. "I'll get Sophie out. No one is taking her or the child." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving Maxim standing in the dark, the heavy silence wrapping around him like a cloak. He turned toward the kitchen and saw Sophie standing there, watching him with a mixture of concern and quiet understanding. "What did they say?" Sophie asked, her voice soft, but there was an underlying tremor in it. Maxim walked over to her, his mind already racing through the next steps. "They know about you, Sophie. They know about the baby." He saw her stiffen, her eyes widening in fear. "We need to move. Now." Sophie's eyes searched his face, and for a brief moment she looked lost. I thought we had time, she whispered. I thought we could figure this out, maybe find a way to control it. There's no time, Maxim said, his voice firm. They won't stop until they have what they want. You, me, and whatever's growing inside you. Sophie's breath caught, and she grabbed Maxim's arm, her grip tight, her voice barely audible. What if they take me? What if they take it from me? Maxim's heart twisted at the raw fear in her voice. They won't. I'll never let that happen. We'll leave New Airless, get you somewhere safe. But where can we go? Sophie asked, her voice breaking. What if we can't outrun them? What if we're not enough? Maxim placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity she had never seen before. We are enough. Together, we'll make it. We'll survive this. Sophie took a deep breath, nodding slowly. Her feline instincts, the natural grace she had, seemed to return, her strength rising again in the face of adversity. All right, let's go. Let's disappear. Maxim grabbed his gear, his fingers trembling only slightly as he secured the weapons. They had a few hours, at most, before the Genetic Council would start their hunt. The city of New Airless, with its sprawling streets and towering buildings, suddenly felt like a cage. But out there, beyond the neon glow, was a chance to escape. The two of them moved swiftly through the apartment, packing what little they could, each step heavy with the realization that this was no longer just a matter of survival. It was a fight for their future. Maxim stole one last glance at the apartment that had become their temporary haven. It had been a brief refuge, a fleeting moment of peace in a world that had grown far too dangerous. Sophie, now standing by the door, looked back at him, her green eyes steady. We're not going to lose, Maxim, she said, her voice quiet but determined. We're not going to let them win. He gave her a quick, reassuring smile before nodding. No, we're not. Maxim and Sophie moved swiftly through the darkened streets of New Airless, the neon lights flickering like the last remnants of a dying city. They had just enough time to pack their essentials before the Genetic Council's operatives closed in on them. The urgency of the situation hung thick in the air, but there was a strange calmness between them, as if they had already accepted the danger they were in. They weren't just running from their enemies, they were running towards something. A future they weren't sure of, but one they had to fight for. Maxim led the way, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Sophie stayed close behind, her steps as silent as a shadow, her natural grace on full display despite the weight of their circumstances. They had learned to move like this, quickly and quietly, always on edge, always aware of the world around them. We need to get to the outer colonies, Maxim said, his voice low but firm. It's the only place where we can lay low long enough to figure out our next move. Sophie nodded, her eyes darting around nervously. Do you think we'll make it there without being found? We don't have a choice, Maxim replied, his tone unwavering. We can't stay here, not with the council watching every move. They took a sharp turn down an alleyway, the flickering lights of the city just out of reach. Maxim could hear Sophie's breathing, soft and steady, but tinged with something else, a fear that she wasn't letting show. He didn't blame her. The stakes had never been higher. He was responsible for her now, for the child she carried, and that responsibility was like a weight he couldn't escape. As they reached the outer edge of the city, where the sprawling industrial district met the forgotten outskirts, Maxim slowed his pace. They had to be careful now. Every step could be their last if the wrong people found them. The council had far-reaching eyes, and Maxim knew it wasn't just soldiers they had on their side. They had spies, informants, anyone they could use to track their targets. You've been quiet, Maxim said, breaking the silence. You all right? Sophie glanced at him, her expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of emotion in her eyes. Just thinking, wondering if we'll make it out of this. I've spent my life running, Maxim, but this is different. This isn't just about survival anymore. Maxim looked at her, his heart tightening in his chest. What do you mean? She took a deep breath, her gaze shifting forward. I never thought I'd be fighting for something bigger than myself, but now I'm fighting for you, for us, for the future of a life we don't even know yet. Maxim stopped walking for a moment, letting her words sink in. He could feel his chest tighten, his breath catching in his throat. The weight of what they were about to face seemed to press down on him even more. They weren't just running from the council anymore. They were running towards something unknown, something beautiful but terrifying. "We'll make it through," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside him. "I won't let them take you, or the baby." Sophie looked at him, a small, hopeful smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I know. I trust you." They continued their journey, moving deeper into the industrial district, where the tall, cold buildings blocked out much of the city's artificial glow. The streets were quieter here, emptier, but that only made Maxim more cautious. They had to stay hidden. The closer they got to their destination, the more tense the atmosphere became. They could feel the eyes of the world on them. Maybe not yet, but soon. They had to be ready. As they passed through an abandoned factory, Maxim stopped again. This time, it wasn't to talk. He had heard something, a faint sound in the distance, the soft scrape of boots on metal. He motioned for Sophie to stop, his hand immediately going to his side, feeling the familiar weight of his weapon. Sophie's eyes widened slightly, her feline instincts kicking in as she silently reached for her own hidden blade. "What is it?" she whispered. Maxim didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned the shadows, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. There was movement ahead, too deliberate, too quiet to be a random passerby. He could feel it in his gut. They were being followed. "They've found us," Sim said, his voice low, but filled with a hard edge. Sophie's body tensed beside him, but she didn't flinch. "How long until they catch up?" Maxim didn't answer. He was already moving again, pulling Sophie along behind him. They needed to stay ahead, keep moving, keep the pressure on. "Stay close. We can't afford to split up now." They raced through the empty factory district, the sounds of their footsteps echoing in the silence. Maxim's pulse raced as he tried to calculate their next move. They couldn't keep running forever. He needed a plan, a way to throw their pursuers off the trail long enough to give them a fighting chance. Then a shout from behind them, a voice Maxim knew all too well. "Stop right there!" He froze. It was too late to keep running. The Genetic Council had found them. They were cornered. Sophie's eyes locked with his, and in that moment, Maxim knew what she was thinking. It wasn't just about escaping anymore. It was about protecting what mattered most. Without a word, he turned toward her, grabbing her hand tightly. "Run," he said, his voice commanding. Sophie hesitated only for a moment before she nodded. The two of them sprinted into the shadows, knowing this was the moment that would decide everything. They were no longer just running from the council. They were fighting for their lives, for the future of a child that neither of them had fully understood until now. Maxim's mind was racing, calculating every possible escape route. The council was coming, but they wouldn't take them without a fight. They had something precious now, something worth protecting. And they weren't going to let it go without one hell of a fight. Maxim's heart raced as he and Sophie boarded a clandestine transport, the airlock sealing behind them with a soft hiss. Their escape was nothing short of miraculous, but as the ship blasted off into the cold void of space, the reality of their situation set in. Sophie had gone from being a stranger to someone Maxim felt he couldn't live without. Yet, the future they had once imagined now felt uncertain, overshadowed by the growing life inside her. For the first time in days, Maxim allowed himself to sit back, rubbing his hand over his face, trying to process everything that had happened. Sophie, however, was not resting. She stood at the viewport, her hands gently resting on her abdomen as she gazed out at the stars. Despite the chaos, there was a calmness about her, a sense of determination that Maxim admired. "They're coming, Maxim," Sophie said, her voice soft but filled with an edge of worry. "They know we're here." Maxim walked up to her, his fingers brushing hers for a brief moment. "I know, but we've got a few hours before we hit the sanctuary. We can't afford to waste them. We'll keep moving, stay ahead of them." Sophie nodded but didn't respond. She was quiet for a long moment, lost in her thoughts. Finally, she turned to him. "Maxim, there's something different about this, about them." Maxim raised an eyebrow, unsure of what she meant. "What do you mean?" "The babies," she said, glancing down at her stomach. "I don't know how to explain it, but it's like they're more aware. I can feel them moving, reacting to things around us. It's not like a normal pregnancy." Maxim's brow furrowed. What do you mean by reacting? They're stronger when you're near me, she said quietly, almost as if the thought startled her. I don't understand it, Maxim, but I know that when you're close, I can feel their energy. They feel alive in a way I can't describe. Maxim stepped closer, his hand hovering near her abdomen, but not touching. He could sense the profound connection she had with the children growing inside her. The bond between them was already something beyond what he had ever experienced. But this, the idea that the children could be aware of their surroundings, of him, was something he hadn't prepared for. Is it possible? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know, Sophie replied, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. But I think whatever this is, it's more than just biology. They're special. Maxim nodded, his thoughts swirling with possibilities. He had seen many strange things in his life. Nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him for Sophie, for what she represented, for what she was carrying. As the hours passed, Sophie's condition continued to change. She moved restlessly through the ship, her heightened senses picking up even the smallest details, the hum of the engines, the vibrations in the walls. She would stop suddenly, her face pale, then continue, like a person caught between two worlds. Her instincts, once sharp, were now heightened in ways Maxim could barely comprehend. Then, as the ship finally neared the sanctuary, a safe haven for those like them, Sophie suddenly doubled over, gasping for air. Maxim was at her side in an instant, his hands steadying her as her body trembled. Sophie? Maxim's voice was urgent, laced with panic. What's happening? It's happening, she whispered, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Maxim, it's time. His heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment he had been dreading and hoping for all at once. I'm here, Sophie. We'll get you through this. Just breathe. Stay with me. Sophie clutched his hand, her grip strong but desperate. I can feel them. They're coming. Maxim's mind raced, but there was no time for hesitation. He lifted her into his arms, carrying her to the ship's medical bay. The sterile environment felt alien, cold, but it was the only place that could offer the care Sophie needed. As he laid her down, Sophie's eyes locked onto his. Maxim, no matter what happens, thank you. You've given me a future I never thought I'd have. You've given me them. He bent down, brushing a lock of hair from her forehead. Don't thank me yet. We're in this together, all of us. The ship's doors slid open, and the medical team rushed in, but Maxim didn't move from Sophie's side. He didn't need to hear the murmurs of the doctors or the preparations around him. All he could focus on was Sophie and the life she carried. Hours later, the birth was quick but intense. The sanctuary's medical team worked swiftly, guided by the expertise of Dr. Lyra, a hybrid physician who had experience with the complexities of interspecies births. The room, designed to adapt to both human and alien biology, shifted colors in response to Sophie's emotional energy. The soft, pulsing light matched Sophie's heightened heartbeat, creating an environment of peace that seemed to calm them both. Maxim stood by Sophie's side the entire time, his hand never leaving hers. He watched as Sophie brought their children into the world, each one born with a unique combination of their two species traits. They were all male, as was typical for Felixian offspring, but their features were a perfect blend of human strength and Felixian grace. The first kitten arrived with a cry that echoed through the room. His skin was a pale jade, his eyes bright and intelligent from the very first moment. His tiny body was strong, more agile than any human child. The next 5 followed, each one displaying distinct traits. Some had Maxim's golden brown skin tone, others Sophie's emerald green features. Their bodies were lean but muscular, their eyes alert, reflecting a brilliance far beyond their years. They're perfect, Sophie breathed, her voice filled with awe and love as she gazed down at their newborn sons. Look how strong they are, how aware. Maxim couldn't speak. He was overwhelmed by the sight before him. The tiny faces, each full of potential, each a living testament to the impossible love he and Sophie had found in one another. They were something new, something the universe had never seen before. Dr. Lyra, watching them closely, nodded approvingly. The readings confirm it. These children are stronger than pure humans and more adaptable than pure Felixians. Their cognitive abilities are off the charts. Maxim didn't know what the future held, but in this moment, With Sophie by his side and their children safely in their arms, he knew one thing for certain. They were no longer just running from the past. They had created a new future, one where love had transcended species and the boundaries of what was possible had been forever changed. Maxim kissed Sophie's forehead, his heart swelling with pride. "We did it," he whispered. Sophie smiled, her eyes filled with tears. "We did." As the children purred in their sleep, each one reaching for both parents with complete trust and love, Maxim and Sophie knew that their story was just beginning. And whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As the first light of dawn streamed through the sanctuary's crystalline walls, Maxim sat beside Sophie, watching their 6 sons sleep peacefully in the soft glow. The world outside was silent for now, but Maxim knew the calm wouldn't last. Their enemies were still out there, and the Genetic Council would not rest until they had their hands on what Sophie had born, the miraculous hybrid children who were poised to change the course of both human and Felixian history. But in this moment, none of that mattered. For the first time in what felt like forever, Maxim could finally breathe. "We did it," Sophie whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she held one of their sons in her arms. His eyes were wide open, absorbing the world around him with an intensity Maxim hadn't expected in such young children. Their potential was already so vast. They weren't just their children, they were the future. Maxim smiled, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and relief. "We did." But even as he spoke, the quiet hum of the sanctuary's system shifted. The calmness that had enveloped the room seemed to thicken, and Maxim could feel a familiar, unsettling sense of urgency building again. His instincts, honed by years of service in special operations, flared to life. The door to the chamber opened slowly, and Dr. Lyra stepped in, her expression unreadable. The hybrid physician was one of the few beings in the universe who had seen a birth like theirs, and likely the last person Maxim wanted to see right now, with everything that was at stake. "Maxim, Sophie," Dr. Lyra began, her voice measured. "There's something you need to know." Maxim turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "What is it?" "There are others," Dr. Lyra said, her words hanging heavy in the air. "Others who have been watching. You're not the only ones." Sophie's eyes flickered with unease as she looked between them. "What do you mean? Watching?" "They've been tracking your progress since the moment your son's birth was confirmed. The Genetic Council was only the beginning. There are those who see the hybrid children as something much more powerful than anyone has imagined, and they're coming." Maxim's heart sank, and he felt Sophie tense beside him. "Who are they?" he demanded, his voice low and hard. Dr. Lyra took a slow breath, her gaze momentarily drifting to the children, their futures hanging in the balance. "The Coalition of Synthesis. They believe that the combination of human and Felixian genetics could unlock abilities beyond what either species has ever known, and they intend to claim that power by any means necessary." Maxim felt a chill run through him. He had thought the Genetic Council was dangerous enough, but this? The Coalition of Synthesis was something else entirely. They weren't just after Sophie and their children. They were after a revolution in the very fabric of life itself. Sophie met Maxim's gaze, her expression hardening. "How long do we have?" "Not long," Dr. Lyra replied. "They're already assembling their forces. They'll be here soon, and they won't stop until they have what they want." Maxim stood up, his fists clenching at his sides. "We can't just run anymore. We've already fought to keep them safe, give them a future. I won't let anyone take that away." Sophie nodded, determination setting into her features. "Then we fight." Maxim turned to Dr. Lyra, his eyes fierce. "What's the plan?" "We need to prepare," she said quietly. "The sanctuary isn't enough to protect you. It's just a temporary refuge. If you want to survive, if you want your children to have a chance, you'll need to go deeper into hiding. But that means facing a new enemy, one that understands the power you've created." Maxim looked down at Sophie and their children, the weight of the responsibility settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was a fight for their legacy, for a future where they could live free without fear. Sophie reached out, taking Maxim's hand in hers. "We'll face them together. We have to, for our children." Maxim squeezed her hand, his resolve hardening. "We will. But it's not over. This is only the beginning." As the room filled with the soft sounds of their children's peaceful breaths, Maxim knew one thing for certain. The war for their future had just begun. And this time, they would fight not just to survive, carve out a future that no one could take from them. They were not just running anymore. They were reclaiming their destiny, and they would face whatever came next, together.